I think just kind of in line with the last video and thinking back to my years of insane practicing habits, I was kind of thinking of, we did the right hand and thinking of the left hand and kind of like what were the insane practice habits that I had at one time for the left hand and what was part of the journey of like getting to be fluid and have a total knowledge and like command of that knowledge of the fretboard. I think like every people hear scales, like people when you get into learning an instrument, like you hear of scales, you know that that's something that you need to learn and work on. Scales and arpeggios is kind of like what you hear. I think that if you don't approach it correctly, it can seem like odd and boring and unclear how it's helpful. So I wanted to go through and kind of like talk about my history with scales. With that being said, I'll say that like my personal history with things like this is not to be very linear in my approach. Actually, I'm not going to say that. That's not true because that's like kind of dismissing years of like violin education. I'm speaking more macro in terms of like nonlinear in that on the mandolin, when I made the decision to learn scales, it was like, oh, okay, I will learn the most intense version of 3 octave scales and have the most intense practice routine around it. I didn't take baby steps. I didn't learn 1 octave scales in each position and then all of that kind of stuff. I did do that on the violin growing up. I did kind of have some classical training and do scales that way. So I can't dismiss that. Like that's learning scales in kind of a basic way. And you'll see as we get into this that that also has really informed my approach to the mandolin and to scales and to how I think about positions and all of that. That being said, I wanted to kind of provide an in for folks who are newer as to be like, if you don't know where to start, if you're just like scales, like what are they scales? Um, what is the most like useful and beneficial place to start? Square one is starting from the root, just single octave scales. So I think the first place to start is going to be either first position scales that are closed, starting from the root. So like this A scale. And then realizing that you can move that literally anywhere on the fretboard and you get a scale that corresponds to your first finger being the root. There's F, there's C sharp, there's E flat, there's A flat. So I would say that's the first thing to learn. Like if you've never worked that out, I would say learn that little shape and then move it all over the fingerboard and like see how cool that is that you can play every scale now. In addition to that, you should also learn the same thing with the open string. So you should learn and understand the way that it is the same. So it's the same as, and it's as if you just move this down a whole step so that your first finger now is the open string. To me, that's the very first, if you've never worked on scales before, start with 1 octave scales starting on the root. That's square one. I think the next thing to learn, if that's something you've done and that's something you've worked on, is the series known as the 4-finger closed positions. And so what this is starting on the root, it's 1 octave scales, and it's showing you how to play the same 1 octave scale starting from each of your different fingers. And so I think for this example, we'll play an A scale and we're going to start way up on the 7th fret. And the purpose of this is so we can start high enough that by the time we get down to starting on our 4th finger, we're actually in a position that we can do that. So the first one is going to be that 1 octave closed position scale starting on the first finger. And that's pretty easy. We know that, that's established. The next thing we're going to do is play the same exact scale, but start on our second finger. And so it's going to now span 3 strings. It's going to span across the D to the E. And then we're going to do the same thing and work it out, starting from our third finger. And then finally, we're going to do the same thing and work it out, starting from our fourth finger. And also, we would want to understand that it's kind of an alternate way of playing. So that would be, I think that's the next step, is to understand the ways that you can find all of the same notes in different places, all over the fingerboard. I think that if you're new to scales and like this is where you're at, I think that this is enough information for you to start getting the benefit of practicing scales. Again, like we talked about in the last video, it's really important to remember why you're doing the exercise and why we're practicing the scales and what the benefit can be of practicing scales. Scales provide a really consistent and simple and almost mindless thing to do with your left hand so that you can practice timing and tone and note length and dynamics and anything else that you can really think of to practice about music, you can practice and apply it to a scale. The other thing that you're definitely doing if you're at this stage of learning scales is getting fretboard knowledge, is increasing your knowledge of the fingerboard. And so when you're doing these scales, it is imperative that you are associating the notes you're playing with note names, associating the notes you're playing ideally with scale degrees, so numbers, so be able to count them out and go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the 8 is the octave, obviously, and be able to go A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, and then do that in every position. And with working on scale degrees and giving yourselves those numbers, then you can also see that you need to be thinking about and working on arpeggios within that. I feel like arpeggios could be a whole other video and a whole other topic that we'll get into. But suffice it to say that it's going to be derived from the idea that you're learning where all of the notes are in relation to the roots of the scales you're playing.
That's awesome. And I just got to say, too, I have so many private students that come to me, and they're like, Hayes, I know all the scale boxes, I know all the scale shapes, but I just haven't, I can't seem to map the fingerboard. I don't know where I am. I don't know any of this stuff. And I was just like kind of chuckling a bit because that's a conversation I've had to have with so many people about, like, when you're practicing that scale, you have to, if you can't think about the note names at tempo, you need to slow that down to where you can think about the note names and drill those into your mind. Otherwise, it's just, to me, useless or meaningless information that you're practicing on the fingerboard, right?
Right. I mean, otherwise, if you're just practicing the sound, then what you're practicing is like making the scale a presentation, which can be interesting. Like, I think that you could play scales in artful ways, and we could talk about, like, even in the examples that I recorded, I was really trying to make them very musical in the way that I was playing them. But again, that's the result of all the good things that I've worked on within scales and can apply to all of the music I play, whether it's scales or not. Yeah, I think especially early on, it is so important to associate note names and scale degrees with the scales you're playing. And I would say that I think it's more important to do that in a smaller sandbox than to learn all of the scales or move on to 3 octave, 2 octave, 3 octave scales. I think that if all you have the time and like energy to do is work out one scale, work out one key, and associate the scale degrees and note names with that one key in one position. I think that's of more benefit than if you were to be able to play all of the scales in every position and not be able to understand all of the notes that you were playing throughout.
I would agree. And what's funny too, right, is if you do that in a limited way with one key, the next key is that much easier and the next one is that much easier. Right? It's almost like a cascade effect. I felt like when I started to learn those things, right? It's very easy to associate that information when you have
Absolutely.
a
And
foothold.
absolutely. And like the steps that we've kind of demonstrated so far of learning one octave scales from the root and then learning one octave scales from the root, but with different finger positions. When you learn, we're talking about when you learn one thing, it kind of leads to another thing. And the mandolin is great for that because it just repeats all over the place.
Oh,
That's
duh,
another
yeah.
nice thing is that it's so repetitive. Like the boxes are repetitive. That's the advantage of learning the closed shapes as opposed to the shapes that incorporate the open strings. The shapes that incorporate the open strings are only useful in that one position. In no other position are they the same fingering. But with anything that is completely closed, that same fingering can be transposed to another key simply by moving the finger you're starting on. And you're also kind of slowly training yourself to get used to all the different shapes that a major scale can look like. And there's only four of them. It's a very finite thing, and it seems things like this, scales and music theory in general, can seem so daunting and so massive, but it is absolutely finite.
There was this thing that happened, at least in my mind, and I'm not a very like technical, organized kind of mind. I'll admit that. But when I did learn those four finger closed position things, there was just like this. All of a sudden, because I was associating names with it, note names, it was just like this grid that just like exists on the mandolin now. You can look at the whole fingerboard, and I can see the A major scale right there. You know what I mean, with my second finger and all that kind of stuff. Just after doing G or C, you know. Yeah.
And then it allows you to, when you do spend your time, if you do spend your time just working on one key, it's like we said, it's totally fine to get really good at one key and to just like know that key in and out. And what you'll find is that because things are repeating, when you're put in the situation of another key, you'll start seeing the ways that that key relates to the key you know really well. And I think learning music is impossible if you look at it as like a linear bar that you're feeling. It's more like this vast landscape and you're just filling in little puzzle pieces all over the place. And I think that you shouldn't ever worry about which puzzle piece you find and like fill in. It doesn't have to happen from the ground up. So, like any little piece of information that you can fit into the already existing information that you have is always useful.
I love that
Um,
analogy of the puzzle pieces too, because that's, if you've ever made a puzzle, you might try and fill out the frame first, like find all those straight edges, which is maybe just like what you're talking about, like knowing that scales are a thing, knowing rhythms and things like that are things you should be practicing. But that stuff that's in the inside, it's, we all learned it differently and in a random order, and that's
right.
great.
Felt like you had to build it from one direction and only move in that direction, then you might see something that's interesting, or you might find a couple pieces that fit together over here and are unrelated, but you would go, oh, that doesn't fit into the direction I'm supposed to go. And that doesn't make any sense. So like obviously you
Yeah.
wouldn't do it with a puzzle, so why would you do it with your education? I think that's probably where to start for a beginner looking at scales is to be working out those simple scales, those one octave scales, those closed position scales, and associating all of the relevant information with them, starting to have a sandbox to practice all the good technique stuff. Moving on from there, we're kind of getting into like serious scale land. And I think that's kind of like the meat of this lesson that I wanted to teach and like kind of what it is my two big approaches that I kind of did on a regular basis for practicing scales and working through these things. And the two approaches were linear 3 octave scales, straight from bottom to top and back down, and lateral scales, working out scales in every position across the fingerboard. And I think of those as the two kind of like major approaches. And they allow you to work on different things in your playing and in your musicality and in your understanding of the scales. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, show me. I need this. What's fun
um,
about this to me too, before you dive in there, is like I did all this on guitar myself, but like never really in like a comprehensive way on the mandolin as I did on the guitar, you know? So I'm very excited to see
I
yours.
think I think that's great because I'm the opposite. Where I've never really practiced scales on the guitar. I think ever. Um, but I've done an insane amount on the mandolin. Let's start with linear 3 octave scales. These are going to be 3 octave scales starting from the lowest possible root and going to the highest possible root that we have on the mandolin. And we can do this for every key except for F, F sharp, and G if you are like me and have 24 frets on the mandolin. If you have more, like Hayes, then you can play those keys. You can play 3 octaves if you ever need to. Let's talk about it. So these really came out of a couple places. The first place that these came out of for me was the Homespun Chris Thiele DVD. He demonstrates one of these, and he demonstrates the accompanying arpeggios, which again, also included in my practice routine coming up, but I think will be a separate kind of lesson and talking about all that. And maybe I'll demonstrate some of that at the end. But in the meantime, that was the first place I learned a 3 octave scale. And I think he only teaches a few of them. He teaches enough that you can kind of understand his fingering for stuff. And in that video, he references where he got it, which is the Carl Fleisch violin book. I think he just says a violin method book, but that's the one that it is. I could go get it, but
I've got the Fleisch method
yeah.
in my catalog. I feel like that's something that every violin student had if they did it, right?
Yeah, it is like the standard violin thing. That was where I first encountered it. And then my teacher coming up in LA was Evan Marshall, who is probably one of the world's leading classical mandolin players and approached teaching from a very like classical violin pedagogy perspective. These scales were an important part of our lessons and like a key part, and how to work on these and how to practice these were a big part of all of that. That being said, I think that's interesting because the mandolin is not the violin. And I think it's interesting to take violin methodology and some of the reasons that these scales are laid out the way they are things that I think make more sense on the violin than the mandolin. So, especially the shifting patterns and where the shifting happens. On the violin, you tend to want to wait till you're on your higher strings to even start shifting at all. That was kind of how I thought about things for a long time. And it was also how I learned the fingerboard. I was very, very good in first position before any of the other positions started happening to me. And to me, that's a very violin-y approach, because in reality, higher up positions on fretted instruments aren't physically any harder, for the most part. Like you don't have the benefit of the open strings to lean back on. I think that if I didn't have that violin perspective, I wouldn't have maybe gone through it this way. And it wasn't till I was kind of thinking about all that later that I came up with the other half of the thing that we're talking about, or started working on the other half, which is the lateral approach, which I think of as like the guitar derived thing. So on the mandolin, it's like for these scales, we're taking from the violin and we're taking from the guitar. which makes total sense.
It's a perfect marriage, right? Because I was even going to mention the violin stuff almost makes sense that the shifting would be different just because they're using a bow instead of a pick. Like the last conversation that we had, the last video that we did was all about the limitations that the pick gives you in terms of string crossing and all that. So the scale, it's natural to think the scales would have to adapt to that too, right?
Oh, and you know, the funny thing about that is like last summer, I got really into working on old time fiddle. And that's inaccurate, but fine. It was more like this spring. But this spring, I got into working on old time fiddle. So I worked out a lot of tunes that I already know, but like on the fiddle and working out bowing. I felt tricked. I felt swindled because the accommodation thing that I'm talking about for picking and the accommodations that you need for picking, fiddle players are doing that all the time. And fiddle melodies are 100% built around things that are physically easy to do with the bow. Not all of
Yeah.
them, obviously, there's exceptions, but so many of the melodies that we're trying to play as guitar and mandolin players and are like, this is so twisty, this causes weird right hand stuff. On the fiddle, it is as easy as the easiest thing for you to play on the guitar. Like they are not working that hard. And I think working on it really made me angry at the supremacy of the fiddle as like we're supposed to be all trying to copy the fiddle and like learn from fiddlers and do that kind of thing. And I hate that, especially after working on it because they're doing the same thing we're all doing. So fiddle players, I think you could do to learn from more pickers and like learn what they're doing because the way that it's difficult for you to execute and make it sound good, that's how it is for mandolin and guitar players trying to play fiddle tunes. Sorry, that was a tangent.
That's a great tangent though, because I think in a more informed way kind of proves what I was like, what my suspicion was. You know what I mean? Because I haven't actually tried fiddle. I did Suzuki method for like a year when I was a teenager or something, and then never took it serious after that. But to hear the passion in your voice makes me think that there is something there. You know? Damn you, fiddle!
In old time and somewhat in bluegrass, but in a lot of genres, the fiddle is just the reigning supreme lead instrument. And
Yeah,
so much is dictated by the fiddle, and so much is talked about copying the fiddle and what the fiddle does. And I think that's great. And I think that you should do that for every instrument. I think like everyone should learn from every other instrument and what they're doing. And I think that the passion is just years of seeing guitar and mandolin players like really struggle with this hard thing and this very noble thing and this very useful thing that I also love to do. But I think that it's okay to be like, no, we want mandolin and guitar tunes that lay out well because that's the instrument we play. Uh,
yeah.
so
No, it makes total sense, and even just having known you for a while and how we both think about music, I think that was almost something that was just like given from the time we even met. Was like, oh yeah, you learn fiddle melodies from the fiddle. Like you just, I'm not gonna listen to Brian Sutton. Sorry, Brian. I'm gonna listen to Kenny Baker or some. You know what I mean? Like play the melody and then
I think that there are a lot of people who teach this kind of music who really teach like you have to learn the original melody. You have to learn that original melody that they played, and that's super important. And I think there's an interesting broader discussion to be had about that. I do think it's often valuable to kind of learn the original melody. Um, I think personally it's most valuable for you to learn the original melody of whatever version got you excited about it. Don't let someone else tell you that there's some more original version that is somehow more legitimate than the version you're excited about. That's what I think. And the other thing is like I think that if you can make an accommodation to sound better, you should always make that accommodation. Like,
yeah, we're straight back to the Big Mon video
yeah.
and conversation that we had. I love it.
Anyways, you can decide how much of that gets in.
That honestly, I think would be like a good short or something like that. Even just
Yeah, I
that
think
little,
it might be a good little
yeah.
extra tangent
Because
for
yeah, it
folks.
was like a good tangent. Yeah. Do you want to show me some of this linear three octave approach? Yeah.
The octave stuff. And in the examples, I go through every key really nicely of all of this. So just starting on G, it's just going to be so. Let's break down what was happening there. That is like the violin-y way. There's a couple other more violin-y ways that we can get into. But as you could see, this first octave is all in first position. All the way up until that C. And then on that C note, I'm shifting so that my first finger is now skipping over the C and landing on the D. And then I continue up now in that position until I get my third finger on this high C, at which point my whole hand shifts up and my first finger lands on the D. And I play the last four notes of the scale. There's examples. And in this case, I'm going down the same way I came up and doing the shifts in exactly the same place.
I was just going to comment on that. Is that standard between all the keys in this approach, or maybe not?
Not. And
Yeah, cool.
I think that that's the thing, going to be the thing to note and the thing to point out in all of this is where the shifts are happening. I also think that that's the major thing to work on. That's the major thing that this sandbox allows you. I think linear scales like this are kind of not the most useful approach because they don't really help you wherever you're at. They kind of help you get from one place to another. They're like a highway. But that can be a useful thing. Sometimes you need to get from one place to another that way. And so I think the big thing that it can really help with is shifting and the whole thing. And so with shifting, the idea is that you're very smoothly moving your whole hand. It's not a slide or a gliss or anything to a new position. And you can do it from any finger to any finger, basically. And so I think in the order of demonstrations that I did yesterday, this comes after, but like I show multiple fingerings, like so you could shift in any different position. So you could go the original way, back down on one string,
One string.
or here's a different. Very even shifting. That was just random. I wasn't even thinking of where it was, but I was thinking, oh, I want to get because I can kind of put it wherever I want. The thought I had was, oh, I want to get up high early, which is a useful thing to be able to do if you're playing, to be like, oh, I'm going to need to get up here, so I'm going to change the fingering so it's so that I'm not stuck down here for this note. And now everything is easier.
You're in position to go. Yeah, I like that.
So that's really the benefit. We can do a whole other lesson on shifting and like some exercises for that, which might be an interesting thing. But I think it's a very violin-y concept that I don't see a lot of guitar and mandolin players talk about, because there's a lot of other good ways to make those moves happen. And
Escape
I think,
strings or any of that kind of stuff, right? Like, yeah, like on guitar, right? There's a million ways to kind of get out of it. Yeah.
yeah, and this is one of the more difficult ways to work up is to have this happen because what you want is to have that note that you're leaving last as long as any of the other notes before shifting and jumping and moving your entire hand and landing in exactly the right place for the next
Yeah.
note. So that's something that these scales can be a great thing to work on. And again, fingerboard knowledge is like everything. So you need to be able to know what these notes are. And the shifting works because I can land in any position and continue on the scale on any string. Like I don't need to rely on that, and it's because I've worked all of this out. So just kind of going through the A flat, I'll play A flat. I think of it as being pretty much the same as G, except that it's different because your first finger is getting those roots. So here's what it looks like. So pretty much once you get past this and shift up here, in this instance, you're shifting from your third finger to your first finger. What I meant by it's the same as the G is that once you're up here, it's the same fingering.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, those are the things to start to notice between all of them. And you'll see that it's kind of broken up into a few sections of like, it's one fingering for this little section, and then it's one fingering for the section that starts on the second finger, and then it's another finger for the section that starts on your third finger. So A is going to be pretty much the same, except if you want, you can incorporate open strings. And we're back. B flat becomes a slightly different pattern, I think. Let's see what it is. It's good in the example.
Yeah, but two shifts, excuse me, on the E string in high position. That's what I noticed in particular about that one. So that made me like, you know, like you kind of like pucker up. It's like, oh man, like that's I don't want to try that one.
And I've done it so much that it's just kind of like I had to play it before thinking about it so I could figure out what I play. But that I think is the most violin-y approach. What's happening in that is just straight from the Carl Fleisch book. There are shifting recommendations in the book, and I think that that's what those are. This to me is where it starts to get weird, is because it's shifting here. Like this is all first position, and then we're going to shift up to the D note here, which is the third of the chord. And I don't know why that's relevant. It just seems relevant. It's how I think. That's what I'm thinking about is like, oh, we shifted to the third.
I'm glad you said that, because for the previous three examples, I was thinking shifting on the fifth. That was like, because they all three shift on the fifth slightly differently in open position, though. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's a smart way to do things, because a shift, no matter how perfectly you do it, is going to be slightly different and slightly imperfect compared to the other notes. So pairing it with a moment maybe of emphasis that's going to sound good, landing on an arpeggio note, is a good strategy. So let's go back here. One of the real awkward things this does is it puts us in second position. So we're here, and the way I learned is to do a quick shift here, and then another quick shift up here, and then a final shift with your pinky for the top note.
There are three shifts. I thought I only counted two. There are actually three. In less than an octave. That's crazy. I love it.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the violin thing. That's what you would learn if you're a violin player, on how to do that. But so and then on the way back down, instead of going getting those as two different shifts, and I don't know why this is the case, but I'm shifting my whole hand down for those 4 notes. So I'm going from this first finger to this fourth finger, which is a pretty wild thing when you think about it, because it's first finger on the 11th fret and then fourth finger on the 10th fret. So you're going from your lowest finger to your highest finger a fret below the note you just played. So and then that's all the same, shifting back down the same way you came.
Yeah.
So that's
Beautiful.
B flat. And B is going to be the same, I think of as being the same. So again, like B flat, you can incorporate that open D and A note into it. B flat, or the key of B, you can't. I usually start in the kind of high first position with keys like B, F sharp, and E on the mandolin. In the lower part of the scale, you're going to have a choice between playing in this kind of half position or playing in a kind of high first position. And so it's a choice you'll always have to make. For these scales, I start in the high first position, and we'll do a little discussion of positions and things like that too. But key of B is, I think of as the same as B flat. C. C becomes different. So C, we're again shifting to second position, and this is going to be shifting from the root to the second, or to the ninth if you want to consider it that. But
Yeah. Much different on the way down than on the way up.
different on the way down, yeah. So let's go through it. That's the first shift. So, starting from here, the real thing to note is this quick little filler shift is what I think of to get us up to a level that we can complete it with our same motion of kind of getting the top 5 notes and being able to kind of use your pinky for that top half step.
If I'm not mistaken, too, this is the same kind of move that we're doing on B flat, right? The C in that upper part of the register. It seems like, yeah.
Yeah. So for G through A, we didn't have that. For B flat through D flat, I think we do incorporate it.
Wow.
Beyond that, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't remember.
Well, let's get back to her, I guess, right?
So that was C. Here's D flat.
Yeah.
So here's D flat. Same as C. That wasn't what I intended to do at all, and that's a good example of how it might not matter. I will say that when you're first learning these, you should pick one and work it out and practice it and be like, this is the first one I'm working on. But at a certain point, like this, when I'm thinking about it too hard and being like, what do? I forget what I do, and then
Yeah.
I'll do something that's going to work. So, but here's what I think I actually do. Maybe that's what I did in the example.
That's funny.
flat. D. So it's like kind of uh, sticking to the, once you get to that, the higher you get, the more the shifts are just on the highest strings, which is so violin-y. Like that makes so much sense as being a violin-y thing. It's like an angle of the strings you use, and the higher you get, the more you're just going to shift up on that single string. And it kind of makes sense for the mandolin. I do think the top two strings are pretty useful, but these notes, I mean, this sounds pretty good.
There is some kind of thin quality and like weird. They're not as full as the other notes on the mandolin for some reason. Like I've noticed it up there too. Yeah.
But I do think there's some merit to working this out in this way. Cool. E flat. Same as D, I think of. E. And then for me personally, I don't have notes higher than that high E. So for F, F sharp, and G, no, so for F and F sharp, I can only do 2 octaves. And sometimes I think I used to practice 2 octaves and then some. So go. I think I would go up to the third. So. Just to kind of give you some sense of that range up there in that key. It's probably as much as I'd ever really use an F, you know.
Don't need to be exhaustive up there in the key of F, right? Yeah.
It's probably what I would do for F sharp is that. That's the linear 3 octave scales. So yeah, so what are we, what are we working on? We're working on fretboard knowledge, like knowing where all those notes are. We're working on shifting. Like this is like the sandbox for working on shifting if that's a concept you're interested in getting into your playing. This is the way to do it. So being able to go on one string and kind of shift in your scale from any position.
Yeah, an exhaustive approach on just one string, even, right?
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
I think that to consider, like, all of those shifts are options. And so when you're working out your shifting strategies for your tune or for the scale that we're working on, find ways to challenge yourself if you're interested in that, and do the harder ones. I do find that if you practice the bigger ones, the shifts from like from fourth finger to first finger and vice versa, and bigger jumps, all the smaller ones become easier. But so that's kind of one of the major things we're working on with these. Also, tone and clarity in these higher registers is something to work on. And then, of course, all the other musical concepts that we've talked about that you can work on with a sandbox like this.
That seems like, yeah, that seems like a pretty, what I want to say, complete picture of this kind of first position open string linear approach, like to shifting and whatnot.
So I think eventually I was doing these scales for years. I when I showed up at college, I could do these in my sleep. Like I knew all of this. But one thing I hadn't worked on as much was scales across the fingerboard and lateral scales, and kind of thinking of the instrument more like a guitar player. So positions, the idea of like positions, it's my understanding, comes out of violin playing and like classical pedagogy. Basically, when we say first position, what that means on the mandolin is that your first finger is where your first finger goes. Your first finger is in the standard position for your first finger on the mandolin. The general rule on the mandolin is that your first finger is going to cover the first two frets. Your second finger is going to cover the next two. Your third finger is going to cover the next two. And your fourth finger is going to cover the final two. So that's the organization of your fingers. If you're ever like, which finger goes where, according to classical violin, whatever, that's what it is. And so when we say we're going to second position, what that means is that we're shifting up so that now our first finger is in the position that our second finger would be. And now all the scale is still the same. The notes don't change. Some of those notes will be in different places now because they're displaced. Your hand is in a different position. And then when your hand is if you were to move your hand up so that your first finger was where your third finger would be, and it goes according to key. So if you're in the key of G and normally your third finger would be on the C string, then that's when your first finger, C note, not string, this is third position. So when your first finger is on the note your third finger would be on, that's third position. In the key of G, that would be on the C note. If you were in the key of A, for example, third position would be when your first finger is on the C sharp note. So it's not about a specific fret, it's about which finger your first finger is replacing.
Yeah. Can I say that you just blew my mind, by the way, because I never knew what the positions were. Like on. Yeah.
This is why I think it's so important to just like define everything and just like not assume that everything is like common knowledge and fully understood. And then as you go up, it's the same. Fourth, if your first finger is where your fourth finger would go, that's fourth position. And then we get up into theoretical fingers as we move on from there. But so that's what positions are when we talk about positions.
Theoretical Fingers, name of our new band, by the way.
The idea here is going to be that we're going to work out all of the notes that we could play for the key that we're in each position. So when we're in first position, we're going to play our G scale, and we're going to play 2 octaves, but we're also going to go up to the highest note that we can get without shifting away, which is going to be our B note on the E string. So that's the idea. And like to play that scale back and forth, start on the root, don't start on the root, whatever you do. The idea is to just get comfortable with staying in that one position and having all of the notes in the scale you're playing accessible to you. The next step then is going to be to move it up to second position. And I tend to start from the lowest note and just go to the highest note. In that way, I also help myself get used to sounds that aren't starting on the root when I'm just practicing scales. I think that's really important in your playing. I think if you just practice scales that start and end on the root, those are the lines you're going to play. So in practicing scales with this way, you're practicing hearing the sound of starting from every note in the scale, which is kind of getting into modes and something I don't want to talk about at all. So,
but if you want to get into modes, practice your scales this way and it'll be much easier.
Also, Maddie says no modes. So yeah, then third position. then fourth position. And one thing you might notice is that this is kind of the extrapolation of our four-finger closed positions, because just like in this key of A here, we have this little box. There's all these other notes. And when we move it down,
Yeah, so that the four-finger positions are inside of each one of those lateral positions somewhere, right? Like that's, yeah.
exactly it. And the lateral positions are just kind of giving you all of the other notes around those four-finger closed positions. So in practicing this, I would generally just take one scale and kind of move up on the highest note and then play it down and then move up on the lowest note, and that kind of sounds like... You could go higher. You could go as high as you want to take it. What you'll start to notice is a lot of repeating patterns, especially if you're just dealing with a major scale. We didn't even really talk about how a major scale is made up and the theory of that. That is probably a whole different lesson.
I have a lesson on that on my channel. Pause this video, go watch that one. It seems to me that like the shifting exercise is a really good way to really test your knowledge on those lateral positions if you've worked all four of them out or whatever, right? Like that's kind of the idea to have that flexibility to move across the mandolin in that way, like in the context of a tune or something, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll say that, like, in terms of the way fingerboard knowledge happens, like, I do want you to be associating note names and scale degrees with the scales, but I think that you can get there in a few different ways. And I know that for me, it was kind of like I worked out these scales and I was working more on the shifting and the sound of it. There were definite moments of having like blind spots on the fingerboard where I would have to take a moment to figure out what it was. And that's where like working on the lateral scales became really useful. And what I am kind of tiptoeing around with all of this is that in my practice routine that I incorporated all of this in, each of these would also be paired with playing arpeggios in each of these positions. So each 3-octave scale, I also did a whole series of 3-octave arpeggios. And so in that way, I'm not only playing the scale, but I'm showing myself all the little bits within the scale and all the elements the scale is made up of. And then the same for the lateral scales. I would go laterally and also play the arpeggios in each key. So not just going, in the example, I'll do a quick example of lateral. And then I would second position.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. And then for the 3-octave scales, I did the whole Carl Fleisch system, which was minor, major, E minor, C major, C minor, E flat, I guess. Diminish.
That one
I think
seems intense to me. For some reason, the four finger one, I'm like, yeah, I can totally do that. Then I see that, I'm like, nope.
yeah, yeah, the idea of it is it's giving you every arpeggio that includes that note. So it's not just G minor and G major, but it's also E minor and E flat. Any arpeggio of any chord that includes a G, it's playing that octave, that three octaves of that arpeggio starting and ending on G. So when I was practicing, when I was in my intense, crazy practice years, I would do two keys of this every day, and that would include the full three octave scales, the full arpeggio exercises, like a whole, and doing a whole lot, to the point of actually getting some kind of musical benefit from them. There was a period of time where I was doing these full three octave scales and arpeggios, the full right hand gauntlet of defeat, and probably a whole bunch of the lateral scales every single day. And that was my warm up. And then I would like start practicing. It was like every day I would do the workout and then play some tunes. And I don't necessarily recommend that unless you're just like, I don't know. I don't
Well,
necessarily.
I mean,
I
I
don't
think
know.
as an outsider, I can see what maybe you're thinking a little bit there. It's like it's not necessary to do that regimen unless you want to become shredder. You know what I mean? Just like unless you want to, if your goal is to become the shreddiest of the shredders, which I think maybe since I knew you back in that time, that was totally your goal. You know what I mean? Just to like be the best, right? Like that.
And
Then
then
yes, do that, right?
yeah, exactly. And the other thing is too is that you don't need to do it all at once. Like we keep getting back to, you can do all of this with one key. Like get really good at G first. Get really good at doing all of this in the key of G, and then add one other key, and then get
Yeah.
really good at those two keys. And you don't have to do every key. You don't have to be equally good in every key. Think about what keys you actually play in. Like those are the keys.
GCDA. Most people could get by there, right?
Absolutely. And that's what you should be working on first. Like get to a level of proficiency within those keys. And then you can worry about being proficient in every situation after that. But, secure your oxygen mask first.
Yeah, I love. Yes, that's the best analogy you can use on that one. And I'll even maybe this is you wouldn't recommend this, but I think I have a lot of students who would be watching this video like, oh my god, I'll never do this. I think getting one thing down at a time means even like get that one lateral position down. If you can't get that one lateral position, focus your energy there because the other ones aren't going to get any better if you don't have that one down. So it's like laying the bricks in the wall, right?
Absolutely. And with the lateral position thing, like I didn't work on lateral positions up the neck like early on in my scales, like that was something that came later. But what I did work on essentially was those lateral positions in first position. So, because of my background with violin and because of like what I was comfortable with, like I could play every two octave scale in every key in first position by the time that I started working on three octave scales. Some of those would be difficult, like some of those, if you had asked me at that moment to play an A flat or a D flat scale, I would really have to think about it, but I could do it in first position first, which I think a lot of people do, and I think is a useful thing. I think it's a very bluegrassy and folky thing.
I love that in the two halves of this scale kind of workout, it is kind of a marriage of those two things that you're talking about. More of like maybe a I don't know if you want to say jazz bluegrassy approach with like the positional playing. That's just how I think of it as a guitar player. But then this classical violin-y thing, which is very foreign, even watching you do this, and I've known you forever. It's like that makes little sense to me until I hear you explain it.
Yeah, I do think it is part of the ethos,
Hmm.
pathos. I don't know. It's part of the ethos of the mandolin. Is that it's not a guitar and it's not a fiddle, and I think that you can tell when people treat it as like a picked fiddle or a little guitar, and it's really something that is its own thing, and also because it's kind of like Wild West pedagogically. Like there's not a long history of mandolin instruction. So we have to take from the traditions that have a longer history and have a lot more established. And so of course we're going to take from where we sit right in the middle. So we're going to take from violin and we're going to take from guitar. And I think that's really how to figure out technique to sound like a mandolin player.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great, Maddie. I love that. Well, I guess I've got a lot of work to do.
Thanks so much for having me, Hayes. This has been, I love presenting some of these kind of more notey or practical topics this way, and having you to like respond and think about these things with is super helpful.
Well, it's really meaningful to me that you want to share this information, and I learn so much every time I sit down and talk with you about this stuff. So it's a little self-serving on my end, but yes, you're welcome. Awesome, Maddie. Thank you so much for sharing all that information with us. For all you folks that are interested in finding out more about Maddie, check the links below in the description. She does have a Patreon, and you can find more in-depth discussions on these types of topics over there. Right, Maddie?
For sure, yeah. And I think that I have an addendum to the right hand gauntlet in the works, and I will do a full lesson on shifting and strategies to practice shifting. I think that's also inevitable. So
great, folks. Well, if you want to, if you've already lapped up the information here in this video, then there's more waiting on you over at Patreon, it sounds like. But yeah, thanks so much, Maddie. You're the best. You're welcome back on the channel anytime, and we'll catch you later.